Hey home bakers, it's Jack here, bakerwithjack.co.uk, bringing you your weekly bread making tip every single Thursday. And this week, here's 3 very easy ways to transform the texture of your homemade loaf. Roll that theme tune. Hello there, welcome back to the Bake with Jack YouTube channel, where I share with you a little bit of my bread making expertise every single Thursday to help you make amazing bread at home. If you get some value out of this video and you like what you see, hey, consider clicking subscribe before you go. Now, a lot of people get in touch with me because they're not entirely 100% satisfied with the texture of their homemade loaf of bread. Like sometimes it's too firm or too crumpety or too moist inside, perhaps. Too much bounce or maybe not enough bounce for your taste. If that sounds like you, then you're in the right place. This week I want to talk about the simplest things that you can try that will transform the texture of your yeasted loaf in its simplest form. And what I mean by a loaf in its simplest form is something straightforward yeasted dough made out of those magic 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. I'm not going to talk about additional ingredients, things like oil, butter, eggs, and stuff of that nature. That seems to be the go-to fix. Like, what can I add to my bread dough to make it softer, to make it firmer, to make it tastier, things of that nature. The reason I'm not going to go into that territory is because you know how highly I value the principles of bread making. Messing around too much with additional ingredients can often overcomplicate things and lead to a messy disaster, especially if you're doing it without the knowledge of the bread making principles. If you have an existing recipe that works for you and you're comfortable with it, but you'd like to tweak the texture of the final loaf a little bit more towards your liking, here are 3 simple things you can try. And at the end of the video, I'd like to raise a point that I consider to be quite important. Let's go. Number 1 is swap out the flour. Yes, you heard me correctly, and this is probably the simplest thing you can do. Think about it, the biggest part of your recipe is flour. It's the majority of the whole. And so flour is the biggest contributor to the texture of your loaf of bread. I'm not talking about adding a bit of spout flour or substituting a bit of white for a bit of brown, because we're messing about with a recipe and we'll have to do additional things to accommodate those changes. I'm talking about base level. Strong white bread flour is always different to the next strong white bread flour in a different packet. Maybe it's cut from a different field of wheat. I don't know, whatever. But the point is, the same type of flour in a different brand will produce a loaf with different characteristics. Swap out your strong white bread flour for another brand of strong white bread flour and keep everything else the same. The process of the recipe you're currently using and the ratio of ingredients within there too. There will likely be a huge change in the texture of your bread, and this is always the first thing that I suggest to try. Swap out your current flour for another flour of the same type and see if you like the bread. Thing to try number 2 is kneading for less time, or possibly longer. I did a video recently that sounded like a good idea at the time, but when I started to film it, I pretty much instantly regretted it. I wanted to see if I could over knead bread dough by hand, and you may have even seen it, but without spoiling it for those of you who haven't seen it yet, for the purpose of some serious scientific research, I ended up kneading the dough for quite some time. The resulting loaf had a fine crumb texture. I'm talking about small bubbles. It had a distinct bounce and chewiness to it, completely different to a loaf that I normally make. Changing the amount of time you knead the dough for will completely transform the texture. When people talk about kneading dough, they often talk about the point where the dough is ready. Like there's 2 different things, like there's either not ready and a fine line between the 2. Well, let me tell you, there's a massive range of ready that will make nice bread, and at each end of the scale, characteristics of the loaf will change dramatically. If you are kneading your bread dough for 15 minutes now, try kneading it for 8 minutes like I do and see the difference in the final loaf. Keep the ingredients the same, keep the overall method the same, tweak the kneading time and see what you think of the bread at the end. Number 3. Rest your dough for longer. If you are making a straight up yeasted white loaf of bread for your sandwiches and toast each week, chances are you are resting the dough in the first place for an hour or so, then shaping up and resting again for an hour or so. And so the third thing you can try is to extend one of the resting periods. Try doing the first rest for 2 hours, for example. Your dough will probably be okay out on the kitchen side for a couple of hours in this country at this time of year, but if it's warm where you are, you might want to give it a little fold up about halfway through to make sure it doesn't puff up too much and collapse. If you'd like to extend the rest even longer, you'll have to cool down your dough. Put it in a big bowl, wrap it in cling film and leave it in the fridge until tomorrow. Or you could even try the slightly more risky overnight final proof in the fridge, which for me works really well. We spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. Adding time to the dough gives the flour the opportunity to absorb that moisture a little bit better and for the gluten to develop even further, resulting in a lighter loaf of bread. And even though in this video we're talking about texture, it also makes for superior flavour. But you already knew that, didn't you? Keep the ingredients the same, the process the same, but extend those resting periods between the steps in the recipe and feel the transformation in your final loaf of bread. The point I consider to be important here that I mentioned at the beginning of the video is all about your expectations. Consider your expectations. If you're expecting to make a loaf at home with exactly the same characteristics as a mass-produced loaf of bread available in your local supermarket, then I'm afraid it's bad news. It won't happen, and that's because you are making bread at home, in your kitchen, with actual real ingredients and with a lot of love. That's not what happens in a factory. Mass-produced loaf of breads that are stacked to the ceiling in plastic bags are made out of pretend. Bits and bobs, this and that, ingredients that you have to Google to find out what they are and what they are doing there. That's why those breads have the characteristics they do, and for me personally, undesirable characteristics. If your expectation is to recreate that supermarket loaf texture, then you're not going to get there without the use of additives and preservatives and emulsifiers and humectants or whatever. Magical powders, fairy dust and hocus pocus is not real, very strange and absolutely not normal. Homemade bread just isn't like that, and hopefully with these 3 tips and things to try and a little bit of trial and error on your part, you'll come up with your own loaf exactly the way that you like it. Be proud of that loaf of bread because you made it. Thanks for watching this week's video. I hope you found it helpful, and if you did, click that thumbs up button to let me know. If you didn't like this video, if you thought it was terrible and you disagreed with everything that I was saying, click the thumbs down button to let me know, and I promise to you, I will not produce another one of these abominations for the next 6 days. See you next week. Thanks for stopping by for your weekly bread making tip, and don't forget, I'm not sure when you're watching this video, but if you're watching at time of release, Christmas is coming up. If you want to buy your home baking loved ones a Bake with Jack bundle this year, you've got a couple of weeks to place your order before the big day. Head over to bakewithjack.co.uk/shop to get yours. See you next week.